Senator Sanders showed skepticism to the Bush administration's claims that Iraq had WMD.
Maybe instead of talking about Iraq every single day and having the media talking about Iraq every single day, maybe we should be protecting elderly people who have lost their life savings in a declining stock market. Maybe we should be protecting the millions of American workers who have seen their jobs go to China and Mexico. Maybe we should be talking about the fact that our healthcare system is collapsing and insurance rates are going up. And many of us are sick and tired that the White House is not focusing on the issues that reflect the needs and concerns of tens and tens of millions of Americans. What we all believe is that working together with the United Nations, with the international community, we can resolve this problem without a unilateral American invasion.
Last year, Senator Sanders also showed similar skepticism when there was claims that Iran had attacked a Japanese vessel.
Second of all,
you don't accept what the Secretary, let me just ask, you don't accept the declaration from the Secretary of State?
No, I don't. I mean, there needs to be an objective investigation. As you know, the Japanese in fact, the owner of the tanker that was attacked disagrees with Trump. But here's the main point that I want to make. If you look at the recent history of this country, I think we understand that the two worst foreign policy disasters were based on lies that came from the White House. You remember the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident that led us to increase military involvement in Vietnam. And man, I could speak, that was my generation. 59,000 brave young men never came home from that war, and tens of thousands of more died, committed suicide, got into drugs when they came home. That was based on a lie. And then you look more recently at the war in Iraq, which I vigorously opposed because I did not believe Cheney, and I did not believe John Bolton, and I did not believe the Bush administration, again, based on a lie that Saddam Hussein in Iraq had weapons of mass destruction.
And again, I think that was very valuable for him to, lay out that kind of skepticism. So given that kind of record, I'm curious why Senator Sanders hasn't similarly pushed back on elements of the Russia investigation, given that the claims about collusion were found to be unproven by the Mueller investigation, and that former high-ranking intelligence officials like Bill Binney and Ray McGovern have highlighted some problems with the government's claims, and also that some of the elements of the Russia investigation and kind of the Russia hysteria that we've seen, that has been kind of weaponized against independent media and also even against Senator Sanders. So again, why do you think it is that Senator Sanders hasn't shown that same sort of skepticism that he did about Iraqi WMD with this narrative about Russia interfering in U.S. elections?
So I think that you're right that moment during the debate when Senator Sanders demonstrated his kind of consistent I would say, I don't know, skepticism is one word to say it. Another word is to say thoughtfulness about the implications, the magnitude of what it means to take the kind of declarative action that some in our government on both sides of the aisle are much quicker to take. He has a healthy skepticism of military solutions to problems that can't be solved militarily, and a much more global and broader historical understanding of the root of some of the world's problems. And I think that understanding is reflected in the consideration that he brings to his foreign policy approach. I would push back against you. I don't know that I agree that he hasn't expressed a similar amount of caution with respect to labeling and making broad proclamations about what has gone on with respect to Russian interference. Although there is evidence, that I think at a certain point becomes conspiratorial not to acknowledge to the extent that there is there is some evidence on the ground there, right? And so I understand the concern that, and I think that it's been reflected in Bernie Sanders' comments and actions, that the priority here as we're heading into 2020 is not to belabor some of the controversies and kind of, dare I say, hysteria that was reflected by some of the news media in the intervening years since 2016. And that there is so much politicization of what happened in 2016 in with respect to the election, that the most effective way to move forward, the most persuasive way to move forward, given that controversy, is to focus on issues that are most relevant to everyday working Americans. And truth be told, the amount of energy spent on Russia by the mainstream news and the kind of counterbalancing that comes from some of our left press is not really reflected when you're door knocking and talking to people on the ground about what their interests are in 2020 and what they want to see in this election. So there's a lot of interest in people wanting the election results to be valid, especially after Iowa. You hear people's concerns about the integrity of the process. But more often than not, when you talk to voters about what is motivating them not to come out, why non-voters are non-voters, why certain independents find themselves not reflected by their interest reflected in either party, they are talking about the kinds of working class grassroots issues that are really the keystone of this campaign. And that, I think, is what you might be characterizing as kind of a difference in approach here across these issues. I think there's been really a smart choice made by this campaign that we need to fight this battle on a kind of higher echelon, and that you see it even now in the conversations about some of the pettiness that's been going on with the mudslinging against Sanders these last couple of weeks. As he's moved into frontrunner status, a lot of people have decided to shoot their shot, as it were. But keeping the conversation focused on Biden's Social Security record, for instance, keeping it focused on what it means for an oligarch like Michael Bloomberg to be trying to buy this election, spending more money on advertising than every other candidate in this race, and what that means for the state of our democracy. Those are conversations that elevate Bernie Sanders as a front runner, the front runner that he is, and puts him up against the real enemies that he's going to be, the real blockers to his nomination, which it's increasingly seeming like are not going to be a number of other candidates, but people like Michael Bloomberg, who are subverting the process, and of course Donald Trump, who is the other billionaire in this race, who is kind of like the upside down version of Donald Trump. And I think that by focusing on those issues, the issues that are front of mind for the average everyday working Americans, whether it's the Black voters in Milwaukee that expressed a great deal of skepticism and frustration about their choices in 2016, whether it's the rural white voters in Iowa, whether it's the rural not so white voters in Iowa, that this campaign turned out at enormously high levels, winning over 50% of the Latino vote in that state. The unifying concern across all of those groups is these kitchen table issues like healthcare, a living wage, housing, national rent control, canceling medical debt, policies like the latter two of which no other candidate in this race is even talking about. And so it can be frustrating sometimes not to have those conversations front and center, not to have reporters asking, why is it that no one else in this race has a plan to cancel medical debt, which only costs about $81 billion, when all of the other Congress people on that stage all the other senators on that stage voted to expand Trump's war budget, which cost similarly about $82 billion, right? Why is it that there is such a lockstep acquiescence to that march toward militarism from someone who everyone on the stage agrees is the most, threatening, the most significant threat, rather, to our republic, but no one in the space of all of this "how can you pay for it" conversation has raised the issue of something like medical debt, which forces 500,000 American families into bankruptcy every year.